Chapter 1. Introduction: The Road to a Revolution. The American War of Independence, which was fought between 1775 and 1783, is one of the defining events in world history. Not only did it mark the beginning of a new nation, the United States of America, but it was also a beacon for the triumph of ideas such as freedom, self-determination, and popular sovereignty, which inspired numerous revolutions in the centuries that followed. But the road to independence was long and by no means predetermined. What began as a conflict between British colonies and the motherland developed into a comprehensive political and military conflict, the outcome of which permanently changed the balance of power in the Atlantic region. The 13 British colonies in North America were closely linked to the empire at the beginning of the 18th century. They benefited from the protection of the British Crown, especially against French and Indian attacks, and they took part in the lively trade with the motherland. But it was precisely this economic dependence, coupled with London's political paternalism, that led to growing tensions over the decades. Many colonists saw themselves as full subjects of the British king, but at the same time demanded political rights to have a say, which they were denied. The starting point of the crisis was the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, which became known in North America as the French and Indian War. This conflict brought Great Britain territorial gains, but also enormous war debts. London tried to shift some of these burdens onto the colonies by introducing new taxes and levies. This met with growing resistance in North America. The famous slogan, "No taxation without representation," became an expression of colonial protest. One was prepared to bear one's share, but only if one was also given a say in the Parliament in Westminster. The situation was exacerbated by a series of laws that were understood in the colonies as encroachments on their autonomy. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and finally the so-called Intolerable Acts met with massive resistance, which erupted in protests, boycotts, and the first forms of organized opposition. Symbolic actions such as the Boston Tea Party in 1773 showed that the conflict could no longer be resolved with words alone. This spiral of repression and resistance gave rise to a movement that increasingly saw itself as an independent force. Local resistance groups such as the Sons of Liberty mobilized broad sections of the population, while political elites united in the Continental Congresses around a common strategy. At the same time, language became radicalized. Demands for fair treatment became calls for independence. The escalation could hardly be stopped. In 1775, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, which were later referred to as the shot heard round the world. A dispute over taxes and self-government had become a full-blown war, a war that was to decide not only the future of the colonies, but also the principles of freedom, rule, and representation. The War of Independence was thus more than just a colonial uprising. It was an experiment that put the ideas of the Enlightenment into practice. The Declaration of Independence in 1776 formulated for the first time in a programmatic way rights that claimed universal character, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These ideals became the foundation not only of the new American nation, but also inspired the French Revolution, the Latin American independence movements, and numerous freedom struggles until the 20th century. But before that happened, the colonies had to endure a long war with heavy losses. They fought not only against the military superiority of the British Empire, but also against internal divisions. Loyalists who remained loyal to the crown faced patriots, and it was not uncommon for entire communities to be torn apart by the Civil War. It was only through a clever combination of political leadership, military steadfastness, and international support, especially from France, that victory could be achieved. The path from the first tax protests to the Treaty of Paris in 1783 is therefore a complex web of political, social, and military developments. In the following chapters, this path will be traced step by step, from the structures of the colonies to the escalation of the crisis, the major battles and diplomatic maneuvers to the far-reaching consequences of the revolution. Chapter 2: The 13 Colonies and Their Society. In order to understand the American War of Independence and its causes, it is essential to take a closer look at the society and structures of the 13 British colonies in North America. These colonies, which established themselves along the Atlantic coast in the course of the 17th and early 18th centuries, formed a heterogeneous world with its own social, economic, and political dynamics, which was at the same time closely linked to the motherland of Great Britain. The colonies stretched from New England in the north to Georgia in the south. This regional diversity also shaped the ways of life. In the north, smaller farms, trade, and crafts dominated. Cities like Boston or New York were lively centers characterized by a growing middle class. In New England, the Puritan tradition also played a formative role, emphasizing education, religiosity, and community. In the central colonial area, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, a particularly pluralistic society developed. People of different origins lived here: English, Dutch, German, Swedish, Scots, and Irish. Religious diversity was characteristic, especially in Pennsylvania, which had been founded by Quakers and practiced tolerance. The South, on the other hand, was characterized by a large plantation economy. In colonies such as Virginia, South Carolina, or Georgia, extensive lands were created on which tobacco, rice, indigo, and later cotton were grown. These plantations increasingly relied on slave labor imported from Africa. While slavery played a subordinate role in the North, it was a central part of the economic system in the South. Already at this time, a field of tension arose that was to deeply shape the later history of the USA. The population of the colonies grew rapidly. In the middle of the 18th century, around 2 million people lived in the 13 colonies, including hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans. This growth led to a dynamic society that began to break away from dependence on the mother country. Many colonists no longer saw themselves as mere immigrants, but as independent Americans, even if the term was only slowly taking shape. Politically, the colonies had a certain autonomy. Each colony had its own assembly or legislature, which was dominated by local elites, mostly landowners. Governors appointed by the crown faced these assemblies. There were often conflicts over tax sovereignty and decision-making power. These early parliamentary traditions gave the colonists an awareness of political participation, which later played a central role in the resistance against Great Britain. The colonies also had their own economic dynamics. They were integrated into the system of mercantilism, which aimed to direct trade in favor of the motherland. Raw materials such as wood, tobacco, or indigo were exported to England, while the colonies imported manufactured goods from Europe in return. This system created dependencies but also growing tensions, as the colonists increasingly felt that they were being exploited economically. Socially, a remarkable social mobility developed. Although there were elites here as well, especially rich planters in the South and wealthy merchants in the North, society was more permeable than in the European mainland. Simple farmers were able to prosper, new settlers received land, and the absence of an encrusted aristocracy opened up opportunities for advancement that were rare in Europe. At the same time, however, there were deep contradictions. While civil liberties and codetermination were upheld, hundreds of thousands of Africans lived in bondage. The indigenous population was also increasingly displaced as the colonists expanded westward. This contradiction between the ideals of freedom and the realities of oppression and slavery was to shape American history for centuries. All in all, the 13 colonies in the 18th century were a dynamic, diverse, and in many respects independent society. They combined European traditions with new experiences in a new world. This self-confidence, coupled with growing discontent with London's politics, prepared the ground for the step towards independence. Chapter 3. British Colonial Policy in the 18th Century. In the 18th century, the relationship between the 13 colonies in Great Britain was characterized by a tension between economic dependence, political paternalism, and growing self-confidence of the colonists. While the colonies were able to manage their internal affairs comparatively freely for a long time, the situation changed increasingly the more London tried to consolidate its control and benefit economically from the colonies. The foundation of this policy was mercantilism, the prevailing economic philosophy at the time. According to this logic, the purpose of the colonies was to serve the motherland. They were to supply raw materials and at the same time act as markets for British manufactured goods. In order to secure this system, Great Britain issued the so-called Navigation Acts as early as the 17th century, which stipulated that colonial goods could only be transported on British ships and that certain goods could only be exported to England. This was to prevent other powers, such as France or the Netherlands, from gaining direct access to the colonies. In everyday life, these regulations meant that the colonies benefited from integration into Atlantic trade, but at the same time felt that their economic freedoms were curtailed. Retailers in the North in particular complained that they were not allowed to sell their products at better prices in other European markets. For a long time, however, this system only worked partially. Due to its geographical distance and limited control, London pursued a policy known as salutary neglect. As long as the colonies remained loyal and made profits, they often turned a blind eye to violations of trade laws. Many colonial traders therefore developed a culture of smuggling and circumventing regulations that was deeply rooted and later triggered considerable resistance to harsher interventions. The real turning point came after the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. Britain had emerged victorious and had ousted France from Canada and much of North America, but the war had cost enormously. The British government was faced with immense debts and was looking for ways to alleviate this burden. Since the colonies had benefited greatly from the military successes, especially from protection against French and Indian attacks, it seemed only fair to London that they should contribute more to the costs in the future. In this logic, the Parliament enacted new tax laws and levies that specifically affected the colonies. The Sugar Act, 1764, increased tariffs on sugar and other imported goods, while the Stamp Act, 1765, introduced a tax on almost all printed materials, such as newspapers, contracts, and playing cards. For the colonists, this was a massive intervention in their everyday lives and a clear expression of political paternalism, as they had no representatives in the British Parliament. In addition, there was the Quartering Act, which provided for British soldiers to be accommodated in the colonies, a measure that was perceived by many as an expression of military occupation. Later, the Townshend Acts 1767 exacerbated the situation by imposing tariffs on numerous imported goods. These interventions led not only to economic resentment, but also to a fundamental political discussion. The colonists developed the formula, "no taxation without representation." They accepted the authority of the king, but rejected taxation by a parliament in which they had no vote. For London, however, this was not an argument. From the British point of view, the colonists were virtually represented in Parliament, as it represented the interests of the entire empire. The gap between the two sides grew steadily. What began as London's pragmatic financial policy developed into a fundamental question of freedom, representation, and self-determination in the colonies. British colonial policy in the 18th century thus became the decisive catalyst for the formation of an independent American identity, and prepared the ground for the conflict that was to culminate in open rebellion a short time later. Chapter 4. The 7 Years' War and its Consequences. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, was a global conflict often referred to as the First World War. It was fought in Europe, India, the Caribbean, on the world's oceans, and, last but not least, in North America, where it became known as the French and Indian War. For the British colonies in North America, this war was crucial. It changed not only the geopolitical situation on the continent, but also the relationship between colonies and the motherland, and thus prepared the ground for the American Revolution. In North America, Great Britain and France faced each other in particular. France controlled large parts of Canada and the Mississippi Valley, while the British owned the 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast. In between were vast areas inhabited by indigenous peoples, whose alliances were crucial for both sides. The immediate trigger of the war was the dispute over the Ohio Valley, a fertile area claimed by both British settlers and French troops. A young officer named George Washington, then just 22 years old, played a key role in the beginning of the conflict. In 1754, he led an expedition to the Ohio area, where there were skirmishes with French soldiers. This incident triggered a chain reaction that soon led to open war. The war was initially unfavorable for the British. The French troops fought skillfully with the support of their indigenous allies and inflicted several defeats on the British, including the disaster of the Battle of Monongahela in 1755, in which General Braddock was killed. But over time, the tide turned. Great Britain mobilized more resources, expanded its fleet, and relied on a strategy that also involved the colonies more closely. In 1759, the decisive blow came with the conquest of Quebec, where General James Wolfe defeated the French troops. With the Treaty of Paris, 1763, France lost almost all of its possessions in North America. Canada fell to Great Britain, and the French presence was henceforth limited to a few islands in the Caribbean. Spain, which had supported France, had to cede Florida to the British. This made Great Britain the undisputed colonial power in North America. For the colonies, this initially meant a triumph. The French threat was averted, and new territories were theoretically open to settlers. But the reality turned out to be more complex. The indigenous peoples, who saw their autonomy threatened, resisted. Particularly well known is the rebellion under Pontiac, a leader of the Ottawa who formed a broad coalition of indigenous tribes against British expansion in 1763. To avoid further conflicts, the British government issued the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited settlers from developing new land west of the Appalachian Mountains. In this way, London wanted to secure stable relations with the indigenous peoples and at the same time reduce administrative costs. For many colonists, however, this was an affront. They had fought in the war and now expected land gains as a reward. Instead, they felt restricted in their expansion plans by the Crown's policies. The financial consequences of the war weighed even heavier. Great Britain was heavily in debt and saw the colonies as the beneficiaries of the victory. It seemed only fair that they should bear a larger share of the costs. This resulted in a series of tax measures such as the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, which led to massive protests. The 7 Years' War was a turning point. Although he eliminated the French threat and opened up supremacy in North America to the British, he also laid the seeds of the conflict between the colonies and the motherland. Gratitude and loyalty quickly turned into frustration and resistance. Many historians therefore see the end of the 7 Years' War as the actual beginning of the American Revolution, a victory that paved the way for the next, even greater conflict. Chapter 5. Tax Policy and Initial Tensions. No taxation without representation. After the 7 Years' War, the relationship between Great Britain and its North American colonies entered a new, conflict-ridden phase. London was financially bled dry and was looking for ways to cover the enormous costs of the war. The British government felt that the colonies, which had ultimately benefited most from the victory over France, now had to make a greater contribution. But it was precisely this attempt to place a greater burden on the colonies that led to a chain of tensions that eventually grew into a revolution. The first step was the Sugar Act of 1764. Although he lowered the existing tariffs on sugar imports, he created stricter controls and measures against smuggling. For many merchants in New England who had previously benefited from rather lax enforcement, this meant a hard cut. Even more serious was the Stamp Act of 1765, which provided for a tax on almost all printed materials: newspapers, pamphlets, certificates, playing cards. This tax affected not only traders or large landowners, but broad sections of the population and intervened directly in the everyday life of the colonists. The reaction was fierce. Resistance formed everywhere in the colonies. Lawyers, printers, merchants, and ordinary citizens saw their rights violated. The central accusation was no taxation without representation. The colonists accepted the authority of the British king, but refused to allow a parliament in London to decide on their taxes without having their own MPs there. For the British side, this argument was incomprehensible. They referred to the principle of virtual representation, according to which Parliament acted in the interests of all subjects of the empire. But for the colonists, this was an inadequate excuse that only made their de facto deprivation of rights even clearer. The protest took many forms. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Craftsmen and producers took the opportunity to offer their own products. In cities such as Boston and New York, resistance groups, the so-called Sons of Liberty, formed with demonstrations, pamphlets, and occasionally violence against tax officials. In some places, there were outright riots, in which representatives of the crown were attacked or their houses destroyed. In 1765, delegates from 9 colonies gathered for the Stamp Act Congress in New York, a first step towards super-regional cooperation. There, a joint petition was addressed to the king demanding the abolition of the tax. Although this Congress still emphasized loyalty to the crown, it was a milestone. It showed that the colonies were capable of acting together. The British government was surprised by the ferocity of the resistance, and in 1766 the Stamp Act was finally repealed. But at the same time, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which reaffirmed its authority and made it clear that it had the right to legislate for the colonies in all cases. Thus, the basic conflict remained unresolved. New taxes soon followed. The Townshend Acts of 1767 introduced tariffs on glass, paper, paints, and tea. This time, too, the colonists reacted with boycotts and protest. Tea in particular became a symbol of resistance, as it was not only an everyday consumer good, but also had a direct connection to the British East India Company. In this phase, a new identity began to emerge. Many colonists increasingly saw themselves not only as Britons demanding their rights, but as an independent community with special interests. Pamphlets, sermons, and newspaper articles shaped a political culture that focused on civil liberties and self-determination. London's tax policy, which was originally intended to be only a pragmatic solution to the debt burden, thus became the trigger for a deep crisis. For the colonists, the question was not only financial, but a fundamental question. Who has the right to determine their lives and their future? The answer, which they formulated more and more clearly in the coming years, was ourselves. Chapter 6. Resistance Forms, from the Sons of Liberty to the Boston Massacre. With the new taxes and duties of the 1760s, a wave of protest had been sparked in the colonies, which became increasingly organized and radicalized. What was initially expressed in pamphlets, boycotts, and petitions grew into a broad resistance movement that changed not only relations with the motherland, but also the collective identity of the colonists. In this phase, networks, symbols, and events emerged that laid the foundation for the later revolution. The Sons of Liberty, a loosely organized group of activists that formed in several colonies, played a central role. Its origins lay in Boston, where personalities such as Samuel Adams and John Hancock became leading minds. The Sons of Liberty organized demonstrations, published pamphlets, and did not shy away from direct action. Tax officials were intimidated, effigies, straw dolls were burned, and in some cases physically attacked. Such measures were intended to prevent British laws from being enforced at all. At the same time, women played an important role in the resistance. Under the name Daughters of Liberty, they supported boycotts of British goods by weaving their own fabrics, producing food, and thus reducing dependence on imports. In this way, the resistance was integrated into everyday life and supported by broad layers of society. Another decisive factor was the Committees of Correspondence, which were established from the early 1770s onwards. These committees served to exchange information between the colonies, coordinate protest actions, and develop a common line. They were the forerunner of a political infrastructure that later took shape in the Continental Congresses. But as the organization grew, so did the confrontation. British soldiers were stationed in several cities to maintain order. The situation came to a head in Boston in particular. The city was a center of resistance, and the presence of British troops was perceived as a provocation by many residents. Tensions between soldiers and civilians repeatedly erupted into fisticuffs. On March 5, 1770, the escalation finally occurred, which went down in history as the Boston Massacre. A crowd of colonists had provoked British soldiers with insults and snowballs, whereupon the soldiers opened fire. 5 people died, including Crispus Attucks, a dock worker of African and Indian origin who later became a symbolic figure of the Revolution. Although it was only a minor incident militarily, the political impact was enormous. Patriotic newspapers and pamphlets portrayed the event as a brutal attack on innocent citizens. Copper engravings, especially the famous depiction by Paul Revere, spread the image of a cold-blooded massacre by the British Army. This massively mobilized public opinion against the colonial power. In the years that followed, phases of relative détente alternated with new conflicts. Although most of the townshend taxes were repealed in 1770, the tax on tea remained in place, symbolic proof that Parliament was sticking to its right to tax. For the colonists, it was clear that it was not just a matter of individual taxes, but of a fundamental balance of power. The years up to 1773 were therefore characterized by growing organization, deeper distrust of London, and increasing polarization. The colonists began to see themselves as a community that had to defend their rights together. The resistance had thus reached a new quality. Local protests had become a movement that was soon to take the decisive step towards revolution. Chapter 7. The Boston Tea Party and the Age of Intolerable Acts. After the Boston Massacre in 1770, the situation seemed to calm down at first. The British government withdrew most of the controversial tariffs. Only the tax on tea remained in place, more out of principle than fiscal necessity. London wanted to reaffirm that Parliament had the right to tax the colonies. For the colonists, however, this tea became a symbol of their deprivation of rights and the next major escalation stage. In 1773, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act, which allowed the ailing British East India Company to export its tea directly to the colonies without having to go through middlemen in England. This meant that the tea could be offered cheaper than the Dutch tea imported by smugglers. Economically, this initially seemed to be an advantage for the colonies, but politically, it was a deliberate provocation. The act was intended to force the colonists to recognize the legitimacy of British taxation, and thus the principle of parliamentary authority. The reaction was clear. Many colonists refused to accept the taxed tea. In several ports, ships were blocked or sent back. The protest erupted most violently in Boston. Here, the Sons of Liberty organized a spectacular action under the leadership of Samuel Adams. On the evening of December 16, 1773, activists, some dressed as Mohawk Indians, climbed aboard 3 ships lying in the harbor and threw 342 crates of tea into the water. This action, later known as the Boston Tea Party, was more than an economic protest. It was a deliberate act of resistance to London's authority, a symbol of the colonists' self-empowerment. The British government reacted indignantly and decided to make an example. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws that became known in the colonies as coercive acts or intolerable acts. These measures were mainly aimed at Massachusetts and Boston. Boston Harbor was closed until the destroyed tea was replaced. Massachusetts' self-government was severely restricted, and governors and officials were given more far-reaching powers. British officials who had committed crimes in the colonies were to be tried in Great Britain in the future. And, in addition, the Quartering Act, which provided for the accommodation of British soldiers in colonial households, was tightened. These measures had far-reaching consequences. Instead of isolating Boston and breaking the resistance, they generated broad solidarity among the colonies.
Aid shipment from the other provinces reached Massachusetts, and an awareness arose that the arbitrariness of the Crown could affect any colony. At the same time, the British Parliament passed the Quebec Act, which extended the borders of the Canadian province of Quebec to the west and granted Catholics there far-reaching religious freedom. Even if this was not directly directed against the colonies, many Protestants in the USA saw it as a signal that London was disregarding their rights and, in case of doubt, would also support religious minorities against them. The year 1773 saw a decisive turning point. The resistance was no longer local or spontaneous, but began to organize itself nationwide. The outrage over the intolerable acts led directly to the convening of the First Continental Congress, at which the colonies discussed their further course of action for the first time. The Boston Tea Party and the subsequent punitive measures made it clear that a return to the old order was hardly possible. What had begun as a dispute over taxes developed into a comprehensive dispute over power, rights, and identity, and the colonists moved closer and closer to the decisive step toward independence.
Chapter 8. The First Continental Congress, 1774. The adoption of the Intolerable Acts in 1774 made it clear to the colonists that these were no longer just local conflicts. If London was willing to deprive Massachusetts of its self-government and paralyze the port of Boston, the same fate could threaten any colony. The idea of a joint, coordinated response therefore quickly gained in importance. Out of this awareness, the First Continental Congress was convened, a milestone on the road to independence. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia. Only Georgia stayed away, as it was still heavily dependent on British protection against indigenous tribes. Nevertheless, it was a remarkably broad alliance. Representatives from New England, the Middle Colonies, and the South came together from very different backgrounds. Traders, lawyers, planters, and intellectuals sat at one table, united by the common concern for their rights. At the same time, the composition reflected the tensions within the movement. There were moderate voices that bet on reconciliation with the Crown, and more radical delegates who were already considering the possibility of secession. Among the leading figures were George Washington, then known as a wealthy planter from Virginia, John Adams and his cousin Samuel Adams from Massachusetts, and Patrick Henry, who became a mouthpiece of the resistance with his famous rhetoric, "Give me liberty or give me death." The Congress worked on several goals. First, a joint declaration of rights and grievances was to be formulated, which made it clear that the colonies were loyal to the Crown but rejected the interference of Parliament in their self-government. Secondly, the delegates decided on an economic embargo on British goods, the so-called Continental Association. From December 1774, imports from Great Britain were to be boycotted, and it was agreed that the export of colonial goods to England would also be stopped if the laws were not withdrawn. Thirdly, a second Congress was announced in the event that London did not give in. This created a permanent structure that went far beyond mere protest actions. An important element was also the establishment of committees to monitor the boycotts in the individual colonies. These committees ensured that British goods were no longer sold or bought and enforced the decisions of Congress at the local level. This began to form a kind of shadow government that increasingly took on the function of official institutions. The reaction in London was negative. For the British Parliament, Congress was an illegal assembly without authority. Instead of responding to the demands, the government prepared for a tougher approach. Troops were reinforced, and intimidation was used to force the colonists back into order. But the First Continental Congress had done something decisive. It had brought the colonies closer together and created a common voice. It was a step from local outrage to a super-regional political movement, a step that laid the foundation for open resistance. When the delegates separated again in October 1774, the tension was palpable. There was still hope for reconciliation, but it was also clear that the colonies were prepared to resist together if necessary.
The path to open conflict was mapped out, and only a few months later, the first shots were to be fired.
Chapter 9. The Outbreak of War, Lexington and Concord. The winter of 1774/75 was marked by growing tension. In the colonies, militias had organized themselves that called themselves Minutemen because they wanted to be ready to take up arms within a minute. In Massachusetts, the focal point of the crisis, resistance groups collected weapons and ammunition, held secret meetings, and prepared for a possible military confrontation. At the same time, the British increased their troop presence in Boston to secure their authority. A collision was only a matter of time. General Thomas Gage, the British commander-in-chief in North America, was given the task of suppressing the growing resistance in Massachusetts and, in particular, confiscating the colonists' supplies. On April 18, 1775, he sent about 700 soldiers on a nightly march towards Concord, where large quantities of weapons and powder were supposedly stored. The goal was to secure these supplies and, at the same time, arrest the leading patriots Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were in Lexington. But the colonists were prepared. Thanks to a network of scouts and messengers, the British march was discovered early. The ride of Paul Revere, who, together with William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, alerted the farmers and militias during the night, became famous. With the cry, "The British are coming," in reality he was probably more likely to speak of regulars, he set in motion a chain reaction that put the region on alert. On the morning of April 19, 1775, the British soldiers met a small group of about 70 Minutemen on the village green of Lexington. The peasants and artisans, armed with muskets, faced the disciplined redcoats. No one knows who fired the first shot, but it went down in history as the shot heard round the world. Within minutes, several colonists fell, and the militia was dispersed. The British marched on to Concord, where they met stronger resistance. A skirmish broke out at the North Bridge, in which the colonists inflicted losses on the British soldiers and forced them to retreat. As the redcoats made their way back to Boston, they were shot at by angry militiamen from all the surrounding villages along the entire march back. Shots were fired from all directions, and the retreat turned into a bloody disaster. Of the approximately 700 British soldiers, more than 70 were killed, more than 170 were wounded, while the colonists' losses were significantly lower. The news spread like wildfire. Within days, thousands of colonists were under arms, and Boston was surrounded by a besieging militia army. What had previously been only political protests had now turned into open war. The events of Lexington and Concord marked the final break between the colonies and the British government. It was no longer just a dispute over taxes or laws. Blood had been shed, and both sides were now enemies. For the colonists, it was clear, a retreat into the old order was hardly possible. For the British, on the other hand, the uprising was an open rebellion that had to be put down. This is how the American Revolutionary War began, with a shot on a village green in Massachusetts that changed the world. Chapter 10. The Second Continental Congress and the Continental Army. After the events of Lexington and Concord in April 1775, it was clear that the crisis between the colonies and Great Britain had reached a new dimension. The open armed conflict made it impossible to return to the previous situation. Now the question arose as to how the colonies should organize and coordinate their resistance. In this situation, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in May 1775. In contrast to the first meeting, which was still intended primarily as a consultation and protest assembly, this Congress now had immediate practical tasks. The delegates had to decide how to react to the military escalation. Again, representatives from all colonies came together, this time also from Georgia, so that for the first time all 13 colonies were represented. The first debates already showed the tensions within the assembly.
On the one hand were delegates like John Adams or his cousin Samuel Adams, who were convinced that the break with Britain was inevitable. On the other hand, there were moderate voices, such as John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who still held on to reconciliation with the Crown and did not want the conflict to escalate into open revolution. Despite these differences, it was agreed that an orderly military structure was necessary. The militias that were already besieging Boston had to be coordinated. The Congress decided to establish a continental army that would bundle the battles of the colonies in the future. This effectively took on the role of a national government, even if formal independence had not yet been declared. The choice of commander-in-chief fell on George Washington of Virginia. This decision was of great symbolic importance. Washington was not only an experienced officer who had served in the 7 Years' War, but also a Southerner. This made it clear that the resistance was not only a New England affair, but was supported jointly by all colonies. Washington accepted the appointment in uniform, showing its willingness to take command in a conflict of historic significance. At the same time, Congress tried to take a final step towards reconciliation. In July 1775, the so-called Olive Branch Petition was passed, which was sent to King George III. In it, the colonies assured their loyalty to the Crown and asked for an end to the repressive measures. But the king sharply rejected this request. Instead, he declared the colonies to be in open rebellion. This closed the door to a peaceful solution once and for all. Meanwhile, the fighting continued. In June 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill near Boston took place, which was a British victory militarily, but showed the colonists that they could take on the troops of the Empire. The price for the British was high. Over 1,000 dead and wounded were offset by comparatively small losses of the colonists. This battle considerably strengthened the self-confidence of the insurrectionists. The Second Continental Congress thus took on a dual role. It was both a political forum and a de facto war leader. He organized finances, issued the first papers as a means of payment, sent envoys abroad, and discussed possible alliances. All this happened while the delegates were still publicly insisting that they were only fighting for their rights within the British Empire. But secretly, it was clear to many that the road to independence had already been taken. The formation of the Continental Army and the appointment of Washington were decisive steps. For the first time, the colonies acted as a common community, creating its own institutions and structures. The idea of a loose protest movement gave way to the image of an emerging nation ready to fight for its freedom.
Chapter 11. George Washington, from Planter to Commander-in-Chief. The appointment of George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army was a decision of far-reaching significance that shaped not only the military leadership of the War of Independence, but also the subsequent development of the young United States. Washington, who came from Virginia, embodied in many ways the connection between the different regions of the colonies and thus offered the ideal symbolic figure for a common cause. Washington was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, in 1732 and grew up on a plantation. Like many members of the colonial elite, he received training in agriculture, land surveying, and the practical affairs of life in the countryside. He showed an early interest in military matters and entered the service of the Virginia militia. His first test came during the French and Indian War, where he fought on the front line as a young officer. Washington is best known for his service in the Ohio Valley, where he led an expedition against the French in 1754 and was involved in a battle that initiated the 7 Years' War in North America. He later served under General Braddock and survived the devastating defeat at Monongahela. Even though he was not only able to show military successes during this time, he earned a reputation as a capable, courageous, and steadfast officer. After the war, Washington withdrew to his plantation, Mount Vernon, which he developed into a prosperous country estate. He married Martha Custis, a wealthy widow, and became one of the richest men in Virginia. Politically, he appeared as a member of the House of Burgesses, where he increasingly campaigned for the interests of the colonies vis-à-vis London. His position was clear:
Loyalty to the crown, yes, but no restriction of the rights of the colonists. As a delegate to both the First and Second Continental Congresses, Washington was a figure of respect through his experience and appearance. He always appeared in uniform, a deliberate signal of his willingness to take responsibility in military combat. Its Southern origins made it particularly valuable, as it ensured that the resistance did not remain a New England movement, but included all colonies. The appointment as Commander-in-Chief in June 1775 was therefore a decision that went far beyond purely military aspects. Washington embodied unity, sacrifice, and leadership. He took on the task seriously, knowing full well that the colonists' resources were limited and that the British Army was considered the most powerful in the world. Washington's leadership style was characterized by discipline, perseverance, and a deep moral conviction. He was not a brilliant tactician in the classical sense, but he knew how to keep his troops together, survive setbacks, and wage war as a conflict of attrition. His greatest goal was to keep the army alive. As long as the Continental Army existed, the Revolution could not be defeated. Even in the first years of the war, it became clear how difficult his task was. The militiamen were often inexperienced, poorly equipped, and only conscripted for a short time. Washington had to fight not only against the British, but also against internal weaknesses such as lack of discipline, supply problems, and political interference. Nevertheless, he gradually succeeded in forming a more powerful army from the heterogeneous militias. George Washington's rise from planter to commander-in-chief symbolized the transformation of the colonies themselves. From dispersed, regionally oriented communities to a united movement that claims to determine its own future. His person became the central anchor point of the Revolution, and early on he was more than just a general. He was the face of the freedom struggle.
Chapter 12. Early Battles and the Conquest of Boston. After George Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, the colonists began to organize their military strategy. Boston was the center of resistance at the time. The city was besieged by thousands of militiamen, but the British troops under General Thomas Gage were well fortified and had supplies and cannons. The question of how Washington and the colonists could gain a decisive advantage determined the first months of the war. The first battles clearly showed the challenges. By early 1775, the shots at Lexington and Concord had already fanned the flames of the Revolution. But the colonists' military organization was still rudimentary. Many militiamen were only on duty for a short time, poorly armed and hardly prepared for longer battles. Washington first had to ensure that the troops were disciplined, cannons were procured, and strategic positions were occupied. A decisive moment occurred in June 1775 at the Battle of Bunker Hill on the Charlestown Heights Peninsula. The colonists built fortifications there to challenge British control of Boston. The British launched several frontal attacks, in which the colonists defended their positions for a long time, but were eventually forced to retreat. The victory of the British was expensive. More than 1,000 British soldiers fell or were wounded, while the colonists' losses were much smaller. This battle proved to the colonists that they could seriously resist the British troops, and at the same time strengthened the moral self-confidence of the Continental Army. In the months that followed, Washington worked to make the siege of Boston more effective. A decisive advantage came when the Continental Army was able to bring artillery and cannons from Fort Ticonderoga, far inland. Under the leadership of Henry Knox, these cannons were transported, a logistical masterpiece. And in March 1776, the colonists used them to establish fortified positions on the hills outside Boston. Faced with this new threat, the British drew the consequences. On March 17, 1776, they left Boston by boarding ships and fleeing towards Canada. This was the first significant strategic victory of the Continental Army. The conquest of Boston was not only militarily important, but also symbolic. It showed that the colonists were capable of driving out the British Army and gave new impetus to the revolutionary movement. The events around Boston marked a turning point.
For the first time, the Continental Army successfully faced a British garrison, and morale in the colonies rose significantly. At the same time, Washington realized that the war would be protracted and difficult. The British fleet continued to dominate the coastal regions, and military defeats in other parts of the country were possible at any time. The early battles made clear Washington's strategic vision. It had to keep the army together, use victories to secure political support, and at the same time minimize losses to keep the revolution alive. Boston's liberation was thus both a military success and a key moment on the road to final independence.
Chapter 13. The Path to the Declaration of Independence in 1776. After the first military successes outside Boston, it became increasingly clear to the colonists that mere resistance to certain taxes and laws would not be enough. The conflicts had developed from local disputes to a full-scale war against the British Crown. In the early months of 1776, debates began about the final step, the independence of the colonies from Great Britain. The political discussions were anything but uniform. Many delegates to the Second Continental Congress, especially from the central colonies, were initially hesitant. They feared the military consequences and the economic risks of a complete separation. At the same time, the voices of radicals grew, led by Massachusetts' John Adams, who argued that the conflict could no longer be resolved without a clear rupture. The situation came to a head as British troops continued to occupy the coasts, and loyalists in various regions of the colonies expressed their support for the Crown. In this polarized situation, the need for a clear political document establishing the principles and rights of the colonies became increasingly urgent. In the spring of 1776, Thomas Jefferson, a young delegate from Virginia, began drafting a Declaration of Independence. Jefferson's goal was to lay out the philosophical underpinnings of insurrection, that all people possess certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments have legitimacy only with the consent of the governed. Jefferson argued that if a government violates these rights, the population has the right to change or remove them. Jefferson's draft was discussed in detail in Congress. Delegates from various colonies introduced amendments, such as linguistic adjustments so as not to expose certain states too much, and the deletion of controversial passages, including those containing criticism of slavery. Nevertheless, the core remained unchanged. The colonies declared their separation from the British Crown and claimed full sovereignty. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration was officially adopted, a date that was later celebrated as the National Day of the United States. The Declaration of Independence was both a political document and a manifesto. It established the legitimacy of the resistance, formulated the rights of the people, and laid bare the goals of the revolutionary movement. The Declaration had far-reaching consequences. It finally turned the conflict into an open war between sovereign states and the most powerful empire in the world. It mobilized the population by declaring the struggle for independence to be morally justified and universal. At the same time, it set a benchmark for international recognition. Even before the United States was militarily secured, its determination and political legitimacy had been made public. The months following the adoption of the Declaration of Independence were marked by military and diplomatic efforts. Washington had to reorganize its army, fight the Loyalist movements, and at the same time maintain popular confidence. The search for foreign support, especially from France, also became crucial to sustaining the war in the long term. The path to the Declaration of Independence in 1776 was thus not only a legal or political step, but an expression of the growing collective identity of the colonies. Scattered protests, local militias, and political debates formed a united people who were ready to fight for their rights, with words and later with weapons. Chapter 14. Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence of 1776 is considered one of the most important documents in world history. It not only marked the political separation of the 13 colonies from Great Britain, but also laid the philosophical foundations of a new nation. Central to this explanation was Thomas Jefferson, the young delegate from Virginia whose pen shaped the basic structure of the text. Jefferson was 33 years old when he began working on the design. He came from a wealthy family of planters, had received a legal education, and was already politically active. Jefferson's thinking was strongly influenced by the ideals of the Enlightenment, especially John Locke. Locke had formulated that people have certain inalienable rights and that governments are only legitimate with the consent of the governed. Jefferson applied these principles to the situation of the colonies. If the British government violated these rights, it was not only the law, but the duty of the people to change or depose the government. Jefferson's design began with a philosophical foundation, the assertion that all men are created equal, and that they possess certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These sentences were intended to underpin the moral legitimacy of the uprising and, at the same time, position the revolution as a universal movement for human rights, not just as a local conflict between colonies and kings. Jefferson also added a list of abuses and violations by the King of Great Britain. This list was precise, detailed, and aimed to document colonial grievances. It ranged from taxation without consent to the restriction of jurisdiction and the suppression of local institutions. Each indictment had the purpose of proving the illegitimacy of British rule and justifying the move to independence. The draft was submitted to the Continental Congress and discussed intensively. Delegates from the northern colonies pushed for stronger, more radical wording, while some southern commissioners acted cautiously, especially because of passages that might affect slavery or the economic interests of individual regions. Some controversial passages, including direct criticism of slavery and slavery by British interests, were deleted in order to reach a broad consensus. On 4 July 1776, the Declaration was officially adopted. At that moment, the colonies formally declared their secession from Great Britain, claimed full sovereignty, and henceforth called themselves the United States of America. Jefferson's text served not only as a political explanation, but also as a moral imperative. The Revolution became a struggle for freedom, justice, and human dignity. The effect of the Declaration was immediately noticeable. Within the colonies, it mobilized the population, created a common political goal, and strengthened the determination to wage war against the British. It gained international attention. France, which would later provide decisive military support, was now able to recognize the American movement as a legitimate political force. The Declaration influenced world history far beyond the American borders. It became a model for other freedom movements, from the French Revolution to independence struggles in Latin America. Its principles, equality, inalienable rights, and the legitimacy of self-determination are still considered the core of democratic ideals today. Jefferson himself later became Secretary of State, Vice President, and eventually Third President of the United States. But his greatest legacy remains the Declaration of Independence, which put the colony's revolutionary claim to freedom and self-determination into clear, universally understandable words and finally paved the way for the American War of Independence.
Chapter 15. The War Expands, Defeats and Victories. With the adoption of the Declaration of Independence in July 1776, the political separation from Great Britain was complete. But the reality on the battlefield remained extremely complicated. The American War of Independence had now taken on a national dimension that brought with it military, social, and economic challenges. The Continental Army under George Washington remained in the minority, poorly equipped and only partially trained, while the British had experienced troops, a powerful fleet, and extensive resources. The first phase after the Declaration of Independence was marked by setbacks. The British relied on a rapid strategy to crush the revolutionary movement before it could consolidate. British troops under General William Howe landed in New York in the summer of 1776 and initially achieved quick successes. The Continental Army was defeated at the Battle of Long Island on August 27, 1776. Thousands of American troops were in danger, and Washington had to organize an orderly retreat across the East River, one of the few brilliant tactical achievements in that defeat. Further setbacks followed in Manhattan and on the run through New Jersey. The morale of the troops sank, and the idea of a military solution seemed to be a distant prospect for many colonists. Many militiamen deserted because they had to feed their families and the prospect of victory seemed slim. The Continental Army was on the verge of dissolution. Washington recognized the need to change strategy. He retreated to defensive guerrilla warfare-like behavior, avoided large battles where the British outnumbered them, and focused on surprise attacks and the use of terrain. A decisive turning point was the Battle of Trenton on December 26, 1776, when Washington surprisingly attacked the Hessian mercenaries in a daring winter crossing of the Delaware River and won a decisive victory. This action significantly boosted the morale of the troops and proved that strategic initiative could compensate for the numerical superiority of the British. The Battle of Princeton in early January 1777 also confirmed this new strategy. Washington once again managed to surprise British units, and its army gained prestige and confidence. Such small but symbolically important victories kept the resistance alive and convinced many previously hesitant colonists to join the Continental Army. Nevertheless, the British remained the militarily superior power. They occupied New York, controlled large parts of the coast, and had superior artillery. The Revolution increasingly became a war of attrition, in which the Americans had to buy time to mobilize international support and tire the British over the length of the conflict. The situation in the colonies also varied from region to region. In the North, especially in New England, the resistance was strongly organized. In the central part of the colonies, the Loyalist movement was strong, and in the South, British troops faced a partly hostile environment. Washington not only had to fight against the British, but also keep internal conflicts and Loyalist movements at bay. Despite these difficulties, the Continental Army managed to survive strategically. Small victories like Trenton and Princeton, coupled with a skillful defensive and the mobilization of local militias, secured the existence of the revolution. At the same time, it became clear that without international support, especially from France, the war would hardly be won. The years 1776 and 1777 were thus marked by a constant alternation of defeats, retreats, and strategic successes. The Continental Army learned that war would be decided not only on the battlefield, but also by morality, political organization, and long-term strategy. This phase prepared the ground for the later decisive victories and international recognition of American independence.
Chapter 16. Foreign Aid, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. After the initial military setbacks, it became increasingly clear to the leaders of the Continental Army that the War of Independence would hardly be won without international support. The colonists had limited resources, poorly trained troops, and only a rudimentary navy, while Great Britain was able to mobilize what is probably the strongest army and fleet in the world. The search for allies, therefore, became a central part of American strategy and led to close ties with France, Spain, and the Netherlands in the 1770s. France was the most important foreign partner of the Americans. The defeat by Britain in the 7 Years' War had still hit France hard, and the thought of a renewed weakening of its British rival was tempting. At first, however, the support was covert. France supplied weapons, ammunition, funds, and instructors to the Continental Army without officially entering the war. Famous figures such as the Marquis de Lafayette, a young French officer, joined the American cause and became symbolic figures of transatlantic engagement. France formally joined in 1778 after the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga. This victory convinced the French king, Louis XVI, that the Americans were indeed capable of challenging the British. The French entry into the war fundamentally changed the dynamic. The colonies now received support in the form of troops, funds, warships, and strategic planning on an international level. Spain entered the war in 1779, not as a direct ally of the Americans, but against Great Britain under the Family Treaty with France. Spain primarily pursued its own interests, in particular the reconquest of Florida and Gibraltar, as well as the control of strategic territories in the Gulf of Mexico. Nevertheless, the Americans benefited indirectly from the Spanish participation in the war, as British forces were now tied up on several fronts and had to withdraw resources. The Netherlands also supported the American Revolution, first through the trade in arms and financial resources, and later also militarily. This led to the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War in 1780, which gave Britain additional fronts and burdens. The involvement of European powers thus created an international balance that opened up the possibility for the Americans to take advantage of strategic advantages. The foreign aid had several decisive effects. Material and weapons. The Continental Army was able to significantly improve its equipment, received artillery, uniforms, and ships. Diplomacy and recognition. The support of France and later Spain legitimized the American independence movement on an international level. Military relief. The presence of French troops and warships tied up British resources heavily, which eased the strategic situation of the Americans. However, cooperation with the European powers was not without problems. Coordination, different goals, and cultural misunderstandings repeatedly led to tensions. Lafayette, Rochambeau, and other officers had to learn to adapt to American conditions, while Washington wanted to retain strategic leadership. Despite these challenges, international support was a decisive factor in the eventual victory. Without France, Spain, and the Netherlands, the conflict would have been almost impossible to win. The military and economic aid contributed significantly to the Americans' perseverance for years, overstretching British warfare and finally winning the decisive battles. Foreign support turned the War of Independence into a global conflict that extended far beyond the borders of North America and had a lasting impact on Britain's international position. Chapter 17. The War in the South and the Role of the Loyalists. While the American War of Independence in the North was initially characterized by symbolic battles such as Saratoga or the Siege of Boston, the war increasingly shifted to the South in the later course. The Southern colonies, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, became the scene of fierce fighting in which Loyalists and Patriots often clashed, and the civilian population was heavily burdened. From 1778 onwards, the British pursued a new strategy in the South, which became known as the Southern Strategy. The aim was to mobilize the Loyalists in the Southern colonies, gain control of strategic cities and plantations, and thus drive a wedge between the Northern and Central colonies. The British leadership hoped that a larger Loyalist base could weaken the Revolution and reintegrate the colonies into the British Empire. In fact, there was a significant Loyalist movement in the Southern colonies. Wealthy planters, merchants, and civil servants who benefited from the British administration supported the Crown for economic, social, or ideological reasons. Loyalists set up militias, provided information to the British, and carried out sometimes brutal actions against the patriotic neighbors. These internal conflicts made the war in the South particularly bloody and complex, because they were often Civil War-like conflicts in which friend fought against friend. The Continental Army under Washington and the local militias therefore had to adapt to changing fronts. American generals such as Nathaniel Breen and Daniel Morgan used the geographical conditions of the South, the dense forests and rivers, to use guerrilla tactics against the British. The Battle of Cowpens in 1781 is considered a masterpiece of this strategy. Morgan used a combination of regular troops and militias, lured the British into a trap, and achieved a decisive victory that weakened British control in the South. Another important element was the mobilization of the black population.
Both loyalists and patriots tried to win enslaved or freed Africans to their causes. Britain offered freedom to many enslaved people if they were involved on the British side. The Americans, in turn, also recruited African Americans to strengthen their ranks. These measures had long-term social implications and highlighted the complexity of the conflict. The fighting in the South was not only decisive militarily, but also politically and psychologically. They forced both sides to adjust their strategies, clarify the loyalist question, and actively secure control over the population. The Southern campaigns showed that the Revolution was not only a conflict between continents, but also a struggle within the colonies, a conflict that divided families, communities, and cities. Despite British superiority, American forces managed to regain control in the South step by step. Coordination with European allies, especially the French troops under Rochambeau and the fleet under de Grasse, played a decisive role in this. The military actions in the South prepared the ground for the later decisive victory at Yorktown, where the main British army in the South finally surrendered. The fighting in the South and the role of the Loyalists illustrate that the American War of Independence was not just a conventional war against a foreign army, but a complex civil war in which ideological, economic, and personal loyalties collided. This area of tension had a lasting impact on American society and left scars that remained visible for generations.
Chapter 18, Yorktown, 1781, The Decisive Victory. The years of war in the South had shown that a quick British victory was impossible. The Continental Army, supported by French troops and improved logistics, had managed to slow down the British advance and recapture key regions. But the decisive blow was still missing that would turn the war in favor of the Americans. This blow fell in Yorktown, Virginia in 1781 and marked the end of Britain's military control over the colonies. The starting position was strategically favorable for the Americans and their allies. The French Navy under Admiral de Grasse had taken control of the Chesapeake Bay, which cut off British troops in Yorktown Harbor from fleeing or resupplying by sea. In the countryside, General George Washington coordinated the troop movements together with the French General Rochambeau, whose units contributed decisively to strengthening the siege. In September 1781, the siege of Yorktown began. The Continental and French troops systematically dug into trenches, gradually advancing and using heavy artillery to undermine the British defenses. The British Army under General Charles Cornwallis was outnumbered and increasingly surrounded. After weeks of siege, food and ammunition were scarce, and hopes of a relief army by the British fleet faded as de Grasse's ships blocked the Chesapeake Bay. On 19 October 1781, the point was reached where Cornwallis saw no chance. He officially capitulated. Over 7,000 British soldiers laid down their arms, and British control over the south of the colonies was finally broken. This victory was not only a military triumph, but also a symbolic breakthrough. For the first time, the British Army had been completely defeated, and the prospect of a complete victory for the Americans became tangible. Yorktown had far-reaching consequences. In Great Britain, the reluctance to go to war grew. The financial costs and ongoing losses led to a decline in political support for the war. The government under Lord North was weakened, and negotiations for peace became inevitable. For the Americans, Yorktown marked a turning point. The combination of military prowess, international support, and strategic skill had paid off. The victory at Yorktown was also proof of the importance of French aid. Without de Grasse's blockade of the Chesapeake Bay and reinforcements from Rochambeau's troops, Cornwallis might have escaped or been reinforced. The international dimension of the war was clearly evident here. American independence was hardly conceivable without the intervention of European powers. After Yorktown, a phase of intensive diplomatic negotiations began, which finally culminated in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. But even before that, it was clear that the military resistance of the Americans had changed the course of history.
The 13 colonies had successfully prevailed against the world's most powerful military power, and the dream of an independent nation became a reality. Yorktown thus remains the symbol of the decisive turning point in the American War of Independence, the moment when the long struggle for freedom, self-determination, and the founding of a new nation achieved its final military victory.
Chapter 19. The Peace of Paris, 1783. The military victory at Yorktown was a decisive step, but formal recognition of American independence still had to be secured through diplomatic channels. The British government was under immense pressure after the disaster in Virginia and the ongoing costs of the war. A political solution was inevitable, and so negotiations began in 1782-83, which finally culminated in the Treaty of Paris. The negotiations were led by a delegation from the United States, including John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay. Their goal was not only to secure independence, but also to expand the territorial claims of the young nation and create a favorable economic basis. At the same time, France, Spain, and the Netherlands were negotiating with Britain about their own interests, making the talks complex and multi-layered. The treaty was signed on 3 September 1783. Great Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. In addition, the territorial borders of the new nation were determined. The United States received land from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, which gave it access to important trade routes and resources. Florida, in turn, went back to Spain, while Canada remained under British control. The Treaty of Paris secured the Americans not only political but also economic freedoms. They were given the right to conduct trade freely and were able to establish their own relations with European powers. At the same time, the treaty was a diplomatic triumph. The young nation had asserted itself on an equal footing with the established powers of the world. For Great Britain, peace was a setback. The empire not only lost control of the 13 colonies, but also had to rethink its global strategy. Nevertheless, Britain retained its strength in Canada, India, and the Caribbean so that it remained a major world power. The Treaty of Paris had far-reaching consequences for the United States. It made it possible to build a new political system, consolidate the Union, and develop a national identity. At the same time, it showed how important international alliances had been in the War of Independence. Without the support of France, Spain, and the Netherlands, the military and political implementation of American independence would hardly have been possible. The treaty laid the foundation for the emergence of the United States as a sovereign state. But the challenges were not over. The young nation now had to create a functioning system of government, achieve economic stability, and deal with social conflicts caused by war, loyalist movements, and divergent state interests. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 therefore marked both the end of the War of Independence and the beginning of a new epoch, the era of the United States of America as an independent and self-determined nation. Chapter 20. Consequences and Significance of the Revolution for America and the World. The American Revolution and the successful War of Independence had far-reaching consequences that went far beyond victory on the battlefield. The 13 colonies had not only achieved their political independence, but also created a model that inspired the ideas of freedom, self-determination, and popular sovereignty worldwide. For the United States itself, the revolution was the beginning of a profound change. Politically, it led to the creation of a federal republic, in which power was divided between the federal and state governments, and citizens were given rights enshrined in a constitution. The experience of war and political organization, continental congresses, committees, military coordination had shown that collective action was possible when there was a common goal. Socially, the revolution led to an increased awareness of civil rights and equality, even if not all groups could immediately benefit from the ideals. Women, slaves, and indigenous peoples were initially largely excluded, but discussions about freedom and equality laid the basis for later reform movements.
African Americans were granted freedom in part through Loyalist and British promises. Women began to act in public debates about rights, and indigenous communities had to redefine their position within the new state. Economically, independence offered new opportunities. The United States could now shape trade relations independent of Great Britain, develop resources in the interior of the country, and introduce its own currency. At the same time, post-war Reconstruction and the integration of the various colonies posed major challenges that were not fully mastered until decades later. Internationally, the Revolution had immense symbolic power. It inspired the French Revolution of 1789, influenced independence movements in Latin America, and showed European rulers that colonial control was not guaranteed forever. France and other states recognized that political alliances and military support could be crucial to shifting the balance of global power. The Revolution also changed the role of ideas and enlightenment in practice. American independence was not just a war for territory, but an experiment in translating the philosophical principles of freedom, law, and self-determination into political reality. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, the Continental Army under Washington, the coordination of the colonies and diplomatic efforts together form a model that is still considered an example of successful revolutions today. The long-term consequences also extend into domestic political developments. The war had shown that national unity, democratic institutions, and military organization had to be linked to each other to stabilize a state. The experiences of war and political organization later led to the drafting of the United States Constitution in 1787, which provided for the balance between federal power and individual rights and remains the basis of American democracy today. In summary, the American Revolution was more than a war against an empire. It was a turning point in the history of ideas, politics, and international relations. It proved that a loose colonial community could successfully fight for its rights, that political ideals can be put into practice, and that international alliances have a decisive influence on the chances of success of a revolutionary movement. The American Revolution thus laid the foundation for the United States of America and inspired the world to an extent that can still be felt today. The 13 colonies were small, economically limited, and militarily weak from the perspective of 1775. But within a few years, the courage, organization, and ideals of their people led to a nation whose influence extended far beyond its geographical borders. The War of Independence was thus not only a military success, but a world historical success that turned the principles of freedom and self-determination into reality and set a new standard for dealing with power, rights, and state legitimacy.